The 9,702nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the maintenance of international peace and security, addressing the historical injustice, and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the United Nations Security Council. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives in the Security Council chamber. Your presence here today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Bahrain, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Finland, India, Italy, Kenya, Kuwait, Luxembourg, Namibia, Pakistan, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Senegal, and Uganda to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate: His Excellency Mr. Dennis Francis, President of the General Assembly, and Ms. Sintembele Mbete, Senior Lecturer, Political Sciences, Faculty of Humanities, University of Pretoria. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite Her Excellency Ms. Katarina Clifford, Chargée d'Affaires, the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2024/574, identical letters dated 30 July 2024 from the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General and the President of the Security Council, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor. You have the floor, please.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank Sierra Leone for convening this debate. Since 1945, the United Nations Security Council has been a bedrock of global peace and security. But the cracks in its foundation are becoming too large to ignore. And they are contributing to deadlock, stalemate, and stagnation around today's most pressing crisis. And they are feeding a broader crisis of credibility and legitimacy that is affecting multilateralism itself. The Security Council was designed by the victors of the Second World War and reflects the power structures of that time. And the world has changed since 1945. But the composition of the Council, despite a few changes, has not kept pace. In 1945, most of today's African countries were still under colonial rule and had no voice in international affairs. This created a glaring omission that has remained unresolved until now. There is no permanent member representing Africa in the Security Council, and the number of elected members from the continent is not in proportion to its importance. We cannot accept that the world's preeminent peace and security body lacks a permanent voice for a continent of well over 1 billion people, a young and rapidly growing population, making up 28% of the membership of the United Nations. Nor can we accept that Africa's views are undervalued on questions of peace and security, both on the continent and around the world. Mr. President, Excellencies, Africa is underrepresented in global governance structures, from the Security Council to international financial institutions, but overrepresented in the very challenges these structures are designed to address. Conflicts, emergencies, and geopolitical divisions have an outsized impact on the African continent. And this Council's agenda demonstrates this. Nearly half of all country-specific or regional conflicts on your agenda concern Africa. They are often exacerbated by greed for Africa's resources, which are vital to the global economy, and further spread and aggravated by the interference of external actors. The message is clear: there can be no global security without African security. Meanwhile, African countries are ground down by crushing debt burdens and the lack of financing thanks to the global financial architecture in which they are underrepresented and denied the level of support they require. And they contend with ferocious flooding and droughts caused by a climate crisis they did nothing to create. But through it all, Africa has proven to be a willing and able partner for peace, particularly with the United Nations, both on the continent and beyond. Through the joint United Nations-African Union framework for enhanced partnership in peace and security, we are addressing complex challenges on the continent, from the Central African Republic to Somalia, the Sahel, and the crisis in Sudan. We are working with the African Union and regional and sub-regional organizations such as ECOWAS to end the scourge of terrorism, which has killed tens of thousands on the African continent, including 11 of our personnel in the Abuja bombing of 2011. Together, we are helping to ensure security, stability, and respect for human rights and the rule of law, while supporting democratic processes and institutions. And this Council's Resolution 2719 has now established a framework for predictable financing of African Union-led peace support operations, authorized by the Security Council through assessed contributions, an important vote of confidence in African capacities and in our partnership. We are now developing a joint roadmap to carry these forward. Meanwhile, African countries host almost half of all UN peacekeeping operations, while contributing troops of their own to global hotspots over the years, including now in Lebanon. Over 40% of UN peacekeepers are African. And let's not forget the meaningful efforts made by African-led forces to restore peace, from Somalia to Lake Chad, from Mozambique to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In times of crisis and geopolitical division, African countries are often amongst the first to champion peace, multilateral solutions, and adherence to international law and UN Charter. But African efforts and contributions are not being matched by Africa's representation. Ensuring this Council's full credibility and legitimacy means heeding the long-standing call for the UN General Assembly, from the UN General Assembly, various geographic groups, from the Arab group to the Benelux, Nordic and CARICOM countries, and some permanent members of this Council itself to correct this injustice. Mr. President, Excellencies, for different parts of the world to contribute to its proceedings, reform of this Council's membership must be accompanied by a democratization of its working methods. A new agenda for peace puts forward a number of ideas, from more burden sharing among Council members to more systematic consultations with host states and regional organizations, as well as with countries contributing troops and police. And it also calls for improvements and innovation in other parts of the global architecture whose work has a bearing on peace and security. It recommends that Member States elevate the work of the Peacebuilding Commission to realize the untapped potential and help mobilize support for national and regional prevention strategies. This includes closer ties with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and regional development banks to secure sustainable financing for countries as they strengthen peace and security, with important implications for countries on the African continent. The Peacebuilding Fund has been a critical catalyst to mobilize the contribution of international financial institutions. The agenda also calls for a revitalized role of the General Assembly in the area of peace and security. A new agenda for peace has been informing negotiations on the Pact for the Future to be adopted at next month's Summit of the Future. The summit provides a critical opportunity to make progress on these issues and help ensure that all countries can meaningfully participate in global governance structures as equals. I urge all Member States to attend and contribute their views and ideas so that African voices are heard, African initiatives are supported, and African needs are met. Monsieur le Président,
President, Excellencies, African voices, African insights, and African participation must be brought to bear across the Council's deliberations and actions. This is not just a question of ethics and justice. It is also a strategic imperative that can increase the global acceptance of Council decisions, benefiting Africa and the world. I call on all Member States to seize this opportunity to forge an ambitious pact of the future that paves the way for a global peace and security architecture that truly represents all countries equally. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for that briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Dennis Francis.
Your Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, Mr. Antonio Gutierrez, Secretary General of the United Nations, Mrs. Mbile Mbete, representing civil society, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Let me begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and to the Permanent Mission of Sierra Leone to the United Nations for the kind invitation to participate in this important open debate. I applaud the choice of theme addressing the historic injustice and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the Security Council, and welcome the decision to also bring an esteemed voice of civil society, Mrs. Mbile Mbete, into the conversation, so ensuring a more fulsome exploration of the issues. For my part, this is just the kind of inclusion which I have sought to promote in the work program of the General Assembly throughout my presidency, and I encourage further deepened collaboration with relevant stakeholders. Excellencies, indeed, today's topic speaks to the urgent and long overdue need to reform the Security Council, a call that resonates too well with Africa as the region that continues to bear the predominant brunt of conflict, and Sierra Leone itself, which has endured but overcome peace and security challenges of its own. And a call that grows louder by the day as the world grapples with crisis after crisis, with the pressure continuously mounting on the United Nations itself. That unacceptable state of affairs, in turn, calls upon this Council, working in close collaboration with the General Assembly, to do much more to take decisive action in the face of recurring violence and unbearable human suffering. As you know better than most, our world is mired in a myriad of challenges, from conflict and climate change to the advent of new masterful technological innovations that are transforming virtually on a daily basis every facet of human existence. The world today is much different than it was in 1945. It is a world in which now 193 member states make up the United Nations, up considerably from the 50 that gathered at San Francisco to establish the UN in 1947. It is a world demanding that institutions adapt to current realities and at the scale and pace required to create meaningful change in people's lives. Amid these pressures, there are legitimate growing calls for a Security Council that is more representative, more responsive, more democratic, and indeed more transparent. There are as well accompanying calls for a revitalized General Assembly that not only assumes a greater role in peace and security matters, but also holds the Security Council as the primary custodian of international security, more accountable for its actions and indeed inaction. Excellencies, for Africa, peace is the key to unlocking its full and extraordinary potential. During my official visits to the continent, I have seen firsthand the consequences of the absence of peace and the importance of the UN's work on the ground. In South Sudan, in particular, I had the privilege of engaging directly with representatives of internally displaced persons, and also spending time with the entities and Blue Helmets proudly serving with the United Nations mission in the Republic of South Sudan. Beyond continental shores, I met with political leaders in Haiti about the deployment of a multinational security support mission led by Kenya following the adoption of Council Resolution 2699. A strengthened role for African countries in addressing global security and development challenges is paramount, as the Council's presidential statement, adopted unanimously in May, makes clear. Africa is home to 54 of the 193 members of the United Nations. The continent accounts for 1.3 billion of the world's people, hosts the majority of UN peacekeeping missions, and consistently provides 4 of the top 10 countries contributing their nationals to the ranks of the Blue Helmets. The fact that Africa continues to be manifestly underrepresented on the Security Council is simply wrong, offending as it does both the principles of equity and inclusion. It runs counter to the principle of sovereign equality of states and calls for urgency to reform this institution to reflect the world as it is now rather than what it was nearly 80 years ago. Let me close by informing that, for its part, the General Assembly is actively engaged in this important issue in the context of the intergovernmental negotiations. It is encouraging that member states do not deny this historical injustice, and we are seeing that momentum is building for change. During the latest iteration of the IGN process, discussions on the 5 clusters and models supported the strengthening of Africa's representation in the Council. As an important outcome of the IGN process, it is further encouraging that the current draft of the input to the Pact of the Future refers to Africa's historical injustice as a matter of priority and treating Africa as a special case. I am pleased that most member states agree that reform of the Council must answer this call. In the end, I hope this actually means something to finally address this historical injustice and will not stand simply as empty pledges without action. Because the question of Africa's effective representation on the Security Council speaks directly to the credibility of the United Nations itself as an inclusive and a democratic organization. As the global institution at the heart of our multilateral system, fighting to deliver global public goods, including peace and security, we cannot continue to take the relevance of the United Nations for granted. We must earn it daily with the actions we take, including meaningful reform, if we are to move our institution forward and establish its credibility among the publics we serve. I commend Sierra Leone's prioritization of the issue of equitable representation in the Security Council and its emphasis on prevention and proactive action in addressing peace and security challenges. I also take this opportunity to encourage all members to continue to contribute constructively to the IGN process under the auspices of the General Assembly. Our objective is to create solutions along a well-designed process, and most importantly, to win back the trust and the confidence of we, the peoples of the United Nations. I thank you.
Thank you, His Excellency, Mr. Francis, for that briefing. And I'll give the floor to Ms. Sintebele Bete.
Your Excellencies, I would like to thank the Presidency of Sierra Leone for hosting this debate on the maintenance of international peace and security, addressing the historical injustice and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the United Nations Security Council, and for giving me this opportunity to brief the Security Council on this matter. In July 2005, at the African Union's 5th Ordinary Session held in Sirte, Libya, Africa's leaders adopted the Common African Position on the proposed reform of the United Nations, commonly known as the Ezulwini Consensus. Negotiated in the lush Ezulwini Valley of the Kingdom of Eswatini, this agreement was a response to the reform process initiated by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change. The Ezulwini Consensus expressed the desire for Africa to be fully represented in all decision-making bodies of the UN, particularly the Security Council. Africa's experience of the UN system over the past 80 years has been one of misrepresentation and under-representation. misrepresentation and the perpetuation of narratives of the continent as a basket case of uncivilized and backward societies who are always recipients of aid rather than agents of progress. Underrepresentation in the exclusion of the continent from permanent membership of the Council, and inadequate representation in the category of non-permanent members. The CAP calls for Africa to have no less than 2 permanent seats with all the prerogatives and privileges of permanent membership, including the right of veto, as well as a total of 5 non-permanent seats. Mr. President, Africa's special claim to being prioritized in the expansion of the Council is threefold. Firstly, repairing the historical injustice of its underrepresentation in global governance. Secondly, recognizing African contributions in shaping the contemporary world order. And thirdly, the urgency of securing the legitimacy of the UN in the face of emerging threats to the maintenance of international peace and security. I will address each of these in turn. The goal of Africa's common position is to correct the historical injustice of Africa's lack of representation and recognition, but also the myriad historical injustices endured by the African continent over the past 500 years. To define these injustices, let's take a trip back in time to the West African coast in 1450. 1450 marks the beginning of over 4 centuries of European slave trade in Africa. It started with the Portuguese capturing Africans to send back to Portugal and to labor in its Atlantic islands. Over the next 450 years, the trade in humans would expand to include other European nations, primarily Britain, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Spain, and Denmark, competing for commercial glory and imperial domination. As Europeans laid claim over territory in the Americas and the Caribbean, the transatlantic slave trade was launched to secure labor for their plantations. Between 1450 and 1888, approximately 12 to 15 million Africans were trafficked across the Atlantic to produce sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cotton for the rapidly expanding global capitalist economy. These commercial crops enriched European nations and forever transformed the demographics of the New World. As African scholar Adekaya Adebajo argues, the West's industrialization was literally built on the back of African slavery. For Africa, the slave trade brought about devastating and irrevocable consequences in the form of depopulation, increased warfare to enslave more people, mass migration, and ecological damage that exacerbated diseases and food insecurity. This sorry history takes us to Berlin in 1884, where, enriched by the products of African slavery, European leaders gathered to partition and parcel out the continent amongst themselves. Hungry for the prestige and riches to be gained from imperial expansion, European presence in Africa was expanded into the interior of the continent, which was declared res nullius, or no man's land, despite the millions of people living there. Justified as a civilizing mission, this plunder of the continent cemented the destruction of economies, state systems, and cultures that was initiated by slavery 400 years earlier. One of those uncivilized Africans wrote in the Lagos Observer in February 1885 that the world has perhaps never witnessed until now such high-handed robbery on so large a scale. Africa is helpless to prevent it. It is on the cards that this Christian business can only end at no distant date in the annihilation of the natives. A major consequence of the Berlin Conference was the imposition of colonial states with borders drawn with a ruler and pencil that divided communities and operated on a logic of extraction and oppression of their populations. This continues to be felt in the unmanageable governance systems on the continent that are often incompatible with democracy and the rule of law. This has led to intractable violent conflicts. In the 30 years since the end of the Cold War, African conflicts have dominated the Council agenda. African subjects took up nearly 50% of the Council's meetings and 70% of its resolutions. As was the case in Berlin over 100 years ago, Africa is permanently on the menu, but Africans do not have a permanent seat at the table. Berlin also laid the foundations for the neocolonialism that continues to define Africa's economic relations with rich nations. Colonialism integrated African economies into the global economy on unequal terms to produce crops and raw materials to meet Western needs. This exploitative relationship continues today. The 2017 Honest Accounts report estimated that Africa loses $203 billion a year through illicit financial flows, profits by multinational corporations, and ecological destruction. With the continent receiving around $161 billion a year in loans, remittances, and aid, this makes Africa a net creditor to the rest of the world to the tune of $41 billion. A few decades after Berlin in 1945, world leaders gathered at San Francisco for the establishment of the United Nations. Of the 51 original member states of the UN, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and the Union of South Africa. Most of Africa was still under colonial rule. Concerns about the legitimacy of the structure, composition, and procedures of the UNSC were already evident in 1945. The head of Egypt's delegation presciently cautioned that permitting any power, great or small, to sit both as judge and jury in its own case does not contribute to building worldwide confidence so necessary to the success of a plan for world order. Indeed. But the seeds of freedom and self-determination sowed by the UN Charter spurred the liberation struggles of people throughout the continent, leading to the spread of decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s. This brings me to my second point of the need to recognize the myriad contributions made by African states to the evolution of the UN. Africa has not been a mere recipient of the UN's largesse, but an active contributor to its success. As more African states gained their independence, they agitated for reform of the Council and indeed succeeded in expanding the Council from 11 to 15 in 1965 with the addition of the elected seats for Africa. African scholar Thandeka Nkiwane observes that despite their relative weakness, newly independent African states used the principles and established forms of international relations and global discourse to advance the cause of sovereignty and self-determination for Africans. Major milestones in the UN's practice and jurisprudence evolved through the activism of African states, including the declaration of apartheid as a crime against humanity and the adoption of the International Apartheid Convention. Personally, I, who was 10 years old in 1994 when South Africa democratized, would not be here without the efforts of other African states, including Sierra Leone. Over the past 60 years, Africans contributed personnel to UN peacekeeping missions, took up the cause of Namibia or Southwest Africa in the International Court of Justice, and took leadership in the organization, including 2 secretaries general, several undersecretaries general, as well as heads of various UN organs. Currently, the AU and regional actors oversee 10 peace operations comprising more than 70,000 authorized personnel spread across 17 African countries. African-led peace operations operate with greater flexibility, enable more rapid response to crisis situations, and have proven more cost-effective. African peace missions have upheld important UN norms by challenging unconstitutional changes of government. Within the Council, successive African members have cooperated as the A3 to spearhead informal reforms of Council practice, including sharing the pen on African issues, promoting closer relations between the UN and regional organizations, and using visiting missions to ensure security interventions are responsive to the needs of the people on the ground in conflict situations. The continent is ready and willing to take up greater leadership and to do so efficiently, effectively, professionally, and with integrity. Finally, the reform of the UN is necessary to ensure its legitimacy in an uncertain future of new and evolving security threats like climate change, novel pandemics, and new technologies like artificial intelligence. Failure of the Security Council to solve major conflicts in the past decade, including Sudan, Libya, the DRC, Syria, Haiti, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Palestine, have dented the credibility of this institution. The UN faces a legitimacy crisis as Generation Z and Alpha are exposed to its impotence in real time on TikTok and other social media platforms. The youth of Africa are the future. 70% of Africans are under the age of 30, and despite living in poverty, they are digitally connected and sharing their direct experience of this institution's failures. Research by Indian scholar Rohan Mukherjee demonstrates that representational legitimacy is a necessary condition for good institutional performance. Because if institutions are perceived to be exclusive and unfair, members gradually reduce their participation and compliance with them. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, I beg your indulgence as we time travel to 2045 to a meeting in this chamber commemorating the 100th anniversary of the UN. At that point, Africa will have 2.3 billion people, making up 25% of the global population. Young Africans, as the most fit and able global demographic, will be the world's workforce and consumer base, keeping the global economy in business. Will the membership of the UN Security Council still look like it does today? Or will the diplomats seated here have had the courage to tackle head-on the power relations preventing meaningful reform? Bringing us back to the present day as we prepare for the UN Summit of the Future, member states have a timely opportunity to advance the agenda of Security Council reform and repair the historical injustice of Africa's exclusion. The AU Committee of 10's proposals on council reform provide a strong basis for Africa to ensure the continent is prioritized in the negotiations. The nature of global threats and the definition of international security have changed dramatically since 1945, and the Council must be adapted to enable it to respond to new security challenges. Such threats can only be resolved by an institution that represents the interests and perspectives of all humanity. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mbete, for that briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, Ministers of Government, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to address the United Nations Security Council with a profound sense of purpose and urgency on a matter of grave importance: the maintenance of international peace and security through the reform of the Security Council. Today, I will specifically focus on addressing the historical injustice and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the Council. I thank the UN Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the President of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly, His Excellency Dennis Francis, and Dr. Sintimbele Bete for their very insightful and thought-provoking briefings. I wholeheartedly welcome the participation of the African Union Committee of 10 heads of state and government on UN security reform and their representatives in this meeting. I also welcome the participation of representatives of member states and interest groups engaged in the intergovernmental negotiations at the UN General Assembly, including the co-chairs, the permanent representatives of Austria and Kuwait, respectively. I thank them for their important work and the urgency with which they are carrying out their mandate under the leadership of the President of the General Assembly. Today, I speak as a representative of a continent that has long been underrepresented in the decision-making process that shape our world on matters of peace and security. It is now a settled view that the UN Security Council needs reforming. The imperative for this reform is irrefutable. Nearly 80 years after its creation, the Council has been stuck in history. Its imbalanced composition is at odds with current realities and unjust, undermining its legitimacy and effectiveness. Africa remains the unquestionable victim. With the absence of structural change, the Security Council's performance and legitimacy remains questionable. Accordingly, as we reflect on the debate's theme and profound implications, it is essential to recognize how the historical injustice has significantly hindered Africa's ability to contribute effectively to global governance. The legacy of colonialism, economic exploitation, and political marginalization has left deep scars on the continent, affecting its development, stability, and influence in international affairs. The UN, the cornerstone of international cooperation, was founded on the principles of equality, justice, and the collective pursuit of peace. Yet, the current structure of the Security Council reflects an outdated world order, an era that fails to recognize Africa's growing importance and contributions. Despite being home to 1.3 billion people and the 53 African countries making 28% of the total membership of the UN, with significant contributions to peacekeeping and conflict resolution, Africa remains grossly underrepresented in this vital organ of the United Nations. This underrepresentation is not merely an anomaly of statistics. It is a profound historical injustice that must be addressed. As a consequence, and under the leadership of C10, Africa has been steadfast in its commitment to rectifying this injustice and imbalance of the UN Security Council. As the coordinator of C10, Sierra Leone has spearheaded efforts to amplify Africa's voice on this issue. Through the African Common Position as espoused in the Ezowini Consensus and the SAT Declaration, Africa has articulated a clear and compelling vision and model for reform, one that ensures equitable representation and meaningful participation of Africa in the Council. Africa demands 2 permanent seats in the UN Security Council and 2 additional non-permanent seats, bringing the total number of non-permanent seats to 5. The African Union will choose the African permanent members. Africa wants the veto abolished. However, if UN member states wish to retain the veto, it must extend it to all new permanent members as a matter of justice. The Common African Position is premised on the fact that by rectifying historical injustice, the international community will not only promote greater fairness, equity, and equality in global governance, but also act on the imperative to ensure the legitimacy and effectiveness of the Council. It will further unlock Africa's full potential as a dynamic and vibrant continent capable of meaningfully contributing to the advancement of peace, stability, and security worldwide. Africa's experiences and perspectives remain invaluable in shaping comprehensive and effective solutions to global challenges. We therefore welcome the general convergence that has emerged from the IGN as reflected in the co-chair's element paper, that there is a wider recognition and broader support by member states of the legitimate aspirations of the African countries to play their rightful role on the global stage, including through an increased presence in the Security Council as reflected in the Ezowini Consensus and SAT Declaration adopted by the African Union in 2005. Redressing the historical injustice against Africa is viewed as a priority, and several delegations emphasized that Africa should be treated as a special case. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to fully understand the need to address the historical injustice being done to Africa, let me briefly underscore the compelling historical foundations. From the arbitrary partition of Africa during and after the colonial rule, African nations were excluded from key international decisions that affected their future. The lack of sovereignty and political representation during those periods has had lasting effects on Africa's ability to shape global policies and institutions. This historical injustice stems from colonial legacies and power imbalances that persist to date. The legacy of slavery intersects with other forms of historical injustice, including colonialism, imperialism, and exploitation. Africa has long been marginalized in global decision-making processes, and its voice are often drowned out. This results in a lack of meaningful representation on issues that directly affect the continent, such as conflict prevention, peacekeeping operations, conflict resolution, and sustainable development. This systemic bias perpetrates a cycle of marginalization and reinforces the false notion of Africa as a passive actor in shaping global affairs. Furthermore, the political marginalization experienced during colonial rule has contributed to ongoing struggles for stable governance and political cohesion within the African states, further complicating their ability to engage robustly on the global stage. Therefore, the current architecture of international institutions, including the UN Security Council, as noted, reflects the geopolitical realities of post-World War II era, which largely excluded African voices. This paradigm of non-representation or underrepresentation means that Africa's perspectives and priorities are regrettably overlooked in global decision-making processes. The absence of permanent African representation in the Security Council means that decisions impacting the continent are made without sufficient African input, leading to policies that may not align with the needs and aspirations of African nations. This council is all too familiar with situations where African mediation and conflict resolution efforts were disregarded for interventions that have had and continue to have disastrous consequences on the continent. In view of the preceding, effective representation of Africa in the Security Council is imperative for several reasons. One, the very legitimacy of the Council. Already the Security Council's imbalanced composition and unjust exclusion of Africa in the permanent category and underrepresentation in the non-permanent category of membership undermines its current legitimacy. The unjust composition also adversely impacts the Council's effectiveness. It has been robustly argued that the performance of institutions like the Security Council declines as its perceived legitimacy diminishes, and that international legitimacy depends on inclusivity and fairness. Therefore, to strengthen the Security Council, the historical injustice against Africa must be rectified as a matter of priority. Second, the importance of upholding equity and justice, particularly for equitable decision-making, cannot be overstated. The historical injustice against Africa contradicts the UN's principle of justice, equity, and democratic representation. As the Council members know too well, these principles directly impact the Council's work. Accordingly, Africa's inclusion in the permanent membership category will ensure that decisions affecting the continent are made with direct and meaningful input from those most impacted. Third, to reflect the present global and geopolitical realities. The geopolitical landscape has significantly evolved since 1945. Africa's growing economic, political, and social influence necessitates its representation in key international forums, including but not limited to the UN Security Council. Given Africa's population, number of member states, political significance, and contributions to international peace and security, the UN's immediate corrective action is crucial. Fourth, the effective maintenance of international peace and security. It is noteworthy that more than 60% of the Council's deliberations, decisions, and peacekeeping missions are concentrated or affect Africa. An enhanced African presence will provide invaluable insights and perspectives that will foster ownership, informed and effective decision-making, and interventions. Africa's demand for reform is rooted in the imperative of addressing the continent's unique challenges and aspirations. African leadership and solutions are crucial for addressing African challenges. From persistent to emerging conflicts, terrorism, famine, and humanitarian crises, Africa faces a myriad of complex issues that necessitate global cooperation and solidarity with African leadership. The question that now comes to mind is how can we address the historical injustice and enhance Africa's representation? I strongly believe that the following steps are necessary and can be even considered imperative. First, the early or urgent reform of the UN Security Council cannot be overemphasized. As the primary body responsible for maintaining international peace and security, the UN must undertake a comprehensive reform of the Security Council to expand its membership and enhance its legitimacy and effectiveness. This must include adding permanent seats for Africa. The issue of the UN Security Council reform has been a long-standing item on the agenda of the UN General Assembly, spanning over 40 years. The work of the open-ended working group started more than 30 years ago, and the current IGN has been ongoing for more than 15 years. Much like the decolonization movement in the 1960s, this reform justice movement for Africa must have an end date. It is absurd for the UN to enter into the 80th decade of existence with this scar of injustice against Africa. Additionally, a natural step to address historical injustice being perpetrated against Africa is to enable the continent's enhanced voice and participation. The UN cannot continue to swim against the tide of justice. The African Union's admission to the G20 remains a welcome development that leads the way. Resolutely, this is where the call for treating Africa as a special case and priority in the UN Security Council reform process is fully strengthened. Reform of the Council and other global governance structures is about equitable representation of Africa. By prioritizing Africa's concern, including enhanced representation within the framework of the UN Security Council reform, the UN can demonstrate its commitment to addressing the root causes of conflict and instability on the continent, thereby advancing the cause of peace and prosperity for all. In addressing the historical injustice done to Africa, and as UN member states, particularly existing permanent members, have supported Africa's call for enhanced representation in the UN Security Council, the next logical step is for this Council and the UN member states to champion the call for Africa to be treated as a special case and priority in the reform process. The fact that this is to be reflected in the Summit of the Futures Pact for the Future is a further welcome development. The swift implementation is the next logical step. As justice delayed is justice denied. The symbolism of today being the International Youth Day reinforces the significance of our endeavor. Excellencies, the time for change is now. The call for enhanced Africa representation in global governance structures, especially the UN Security Council, is not just a demand for justice and equity. It is a call for more inclusive, effective, and legitimate international governance system. Let us work together to redress this historical injustice and recreate a Security Council that truly represents the world in its diversity. The time for half measures and incremental progress is over. Africa must be heard, and its demands for justice and equity must be met. In rectifying the historical injustice that has long plagued the continent, the UN has an opportunity to forge a more just and inclusive world order, one that honors the dignity and aspirations of all nations, regardless of their size and stature. Now is the time for action. Africa cannot wait any longer. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I give the floor to Her Excellency, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States and member of President Biden's cabinet.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start by thanking you for being here with us today and for your leadership in organizing this critical debate, the first ever in the Security Council. I would also like to thank Secretary General Guterres, President Francis, and our civil society briefer, Ms. Mbete, for bringing their invaluable perspectives to the table. Colleagues, it has been nearly 8 decades since the Council first met, and its architects couldn't have imagined then what the world would look like today, as we can imagine what it might look like 70 years from now, how demographics would shift, what global challenges would emerge, which international powers would rise up. The earliest beginnings of this body were just that. They were the beginning. Now it is upon all of us, all members of the United Nations, to chart the future for the next generation, to refine, reform, recalibrate, and as my UK neighbor reminded me last night, to strengthen this body, to ensure the Council is more fit for purpose and reflects the realities of today. And that includes ensuring that people across Africa are effectively represented here in the Security Council in this chamber. Of course, as you've heard, this is long overdue. Already home to over 1.2 billion people, half of whom are under the age of 19, Africa has the fastest growing population of any continent. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African. And here's what we know. African countries have long played and continue to play a critical role in strengthening peace and security in Africa and across the globe. These countries have advanced this work through their leadership on this council, through their outsized contributions to peacekeeping missions, through their leadership on climate, on food security, on gender, on youth, peace and security, and through their efforts to resolve conflicts, including those on the other side of the world. And in that vein, I want to recognize Kenya's contribution to the multilateral security support mission to combat gangs in Haiti, showing that Africa's leadership on this council is not just about Africa, but about the world, and that Africa's problems are not Africa's alone to deal with. And so when we talk about reforming this council, strengthening this council, we do so not just for the good of African nations, but to further international peace and security for us all, because we all benefit when African leaders are at the table. And so as President Biden announced during the UN General Assembly 2 years ago and reaffirmed last year, the United States supports permanent representation on the Council for countries from Africa as well as Latin America and the Caribbean. Permanent representation. Since that announcement, I have met with leaders from around the world to hear their perspectives on Security Council reform. Our approaches and ideas are often different, but we agree on one thing, and we agree on what the problem is, and we agree on what the goals are. So dialogue is critical. It is the only way to advance an issue that has been stuck for far too long. For our part, the United States is advocating for language in the Pact for the Future that supports increasing both permanent and non-permanent seats on the Security Council. And we will push to ensure that the Summit of the Future is a platform for meaningful progress, one that creates a pathway for urgent action on Security Council reform. At the summit and beyond, we will keep working to achieve Council reform. As we work toward that goal, we must also pursue every other avenue we can to ensure effective UN action to prevent and respond to security threats on the African continent and around the globe. In Sudan and Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Gaza, Ukraine, the list could unfortunately go on and on. Violence continues to uproot lives and destroy livelihoods, to exacerbate food insecurity and re-entrench gender inequality, to repeat dark chapters of history. We need stronger, faster, and more effective action from the Security Council to put an end to this violence. And that is why the United States fully supported the adoption of Resolution 2719, creating a framework for the use of UN-assessed contributions for African Union-led peace support operations. This landmark resolution, adopted under the leadership of the A3, creates opportunities to strengthen UN-AU partnerships and to ensure that the UN is responsive to security needs on the continent. We will continue to work closely with our colleagues here in New York and in Addis to operationalize this new arrangement. But colleagues, we must also fight against any attempt to undermine Council action in support of Africa. Just look at the threats facing various panels of experts. These panels are critical UN tools that provide Security Council members with credible, timely, and detailed information about security threats. And yet, as of late, some on this Council have tried to wind down or obstruct these panels of experts, particularly in Africa. It is imperative that we push back against these efforts to weaken our understanding of security dynamics in Africa and around the world. As many of you know, I spent a good part of my life, my career, living and working on the continent of Africa, engaging with people on the continent, doing my part to further peace and security, support refugees in the countries who host them, human rights and development, and observing up close the ways in which Africa, its people, and countries are stepping up to lead. And as I sit here representing the United States at the United Nations, I carry those life experiences with me, fueling my own commitment to making this Council more representative and more effective. So let's stop admiring the problem here. We need to move to solutions. Today, 15 of us sit around this table, and it is my hope that the number grows to include permanent seats for Africa, Latin America, and others, and that in so doing, we're better equipped to live up to the mandate, our mandate, to prevent the scourge of war and advance peace and security for future generations. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to Sierra Leone for bringing this important subject to this chamber.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that statement. And I'll give the floor to His Excellency Lord Collins Highbury, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, President. And can I start by also thanking the Secretary-General Guterres and President Francis and Ms. Mbete for their excellent briefings to start this discussion. And it's a real privilege to join you today as the United Kingdom's new Minister for Africa and the United Nations. I am very grateful to Your Excellency, President Bebo, for putting this vital issue on the agenda. It's important that we have this discussion today. We are running out of time. The challenges we face today do not respect borders, and they are sorely testing the international order the United Nations has championed. The highest number of conflicts since the Second World War, a worsening climate crisis, widespread economic hardship, and desperate humanitarian need. This is all fueling a pervasive sense of insecurity, and we must find truly global solutions to these problems. Let me take this opportunity to underscore the United Kingdom's belief that multilateral institutions remain indispensable here, but they are struggling under the strain of new global challenges. For these institutions to represent the world of today, they must be as effective as they can be. So we will work tirelessly with our allies and partners to strengthen them. For this Council, that means expanding our membership in both categories to include permanent African representation as a matter of urgency. We have seen how much African members bring to this chamber through their experience and expertise, particularly, as we've heard, in terms of responding to conflict and promoting peace and security. And as Ms. Mbete said, they are vital agents for change and progress, and they must be heard. The UK is proud to be working alongside our African partners on issues at the forefront of the Council's agenda. This includes on Sudan, where we seek a political solution to end the devastation man-made crisis which has now resulted in famine in the country. Or Somalia, where the Council is working closely with the African Union and Somali authorities to support security transition and counter al-Shabaab. President, Your Excellency, your own country's experience of transitioning from war to peace in partnership with the United Nations provides us with valuable lessons. Of course, I recognise that the obstacles to reform are significant, but the United Kingdom is determined, absolutely determined, to overcome them. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Lord Collins of Highbury, for that statement. And I'll give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Leone Magraman, Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and National Community Abroad of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellency, Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. I'm honored to convey to you all and to the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, His Excellency Mr. Julius Maada Bio, specifically the greetings of the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, who wishes you success in your deliberations today. He is fully confident that this open debate convened by the Republic of Sierra Leone, coordinator of the C10 on Security Council reform, would contribute to informing Council members on the pillars and objectives of the common African position. I would also like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and the President of the 78th session of the General Assembly, Mr. Dennis Francis, for their valuable briefings that have set the scene and reviewed the latest developments in the Security Council reform process and the challenges in this regard. We have listened carefully to the representative of civil society, Ms. Sitembile Mbete. I would also like to welcome the high-level participation of His Excellency, Mr. Pia Mushelenga, Minister of Internal Relations and Cooperation from Namibia, and His Excellency, General J.J. Odongo Abubakar, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Uganda. Mr. President, our meeting today is held in an international and regional context that is fraught with challenges and risks that undermine international peace and security, a context that is characterized by renewed politicization and polarization, rather, between major powers, by the erosion of international law, by relapse into a selective approach in determining UN priorities, by the application of double standards, by an increasing choice to use force as a way to settle disputes. We are witnessing a severe crisis in the collective security architecture. The Security Council is almost completely paralyzed. It has repeatedly failed to put an end or even to curb fait accompli policies and unilateral measures. The Security Council has been giving precedence to the interests of the powerful over the interests of the weak. It has been providing protection and political cover to the acts of the shamefully unjust at the expense of the legitimate rights of those who have been wronged. In this crisis, the international community is standing idly by as crisis after crisis unfold and deteriorate in an unprecedented manner. This makes it difficult to deal effectively with these crises and threatens the possibility of reaching solutions that contribute to achieving international peace and security. The African continent has been suffering from this painful reality, especially in the Sahel region. Security, development, and humanitarian challenges have taken worrying dimensions. There are increasing external interventions. There are conflicts of interest. Terrorism has been on the rise. Organized crime has been on the rise. There have been increasing hotspots, and there have been worrying unconstitutional changes in these countries. This is reminiscent of a period of time that we thought has long gone. These developments prompt us all to continue working together to allow African countries that are going through turmoil to go back to the political track and to give precedence to dialogue and consensual solutions that do not exclude anybody to achieve peace and security and stability that these countries aspire to. In the same context, we have to remind you of the continued suffering of the Sahrawi people in Western Sahara, occupied for more than 50 years. These people have been waiting patiently for recognition by the international community of its right, inalienable right to self-determination and ending the exploitation of its natural resources in an illegal way. It has been waiting for stopping the practices of occupation that violate its legitimate rights. These people have been looking for the implementation of Security Council resolutions and taking tangible action to push forward the settlement process as part of decolonization efforts by the UN according to the parameters agreed upon by the Security Council. Of course, we have to recall the suffering of the brotherly Palestinian people that is deteriorating day after day amid the genocidal war launched by the occupation forces on the Palestinian people for more than 10 months as a result of the inability of the Security Council to compel the Israeli occupier to stop its violation and its crimes, its violations of international law. The expansionist Israeli occupation is completely disregarding international law. Mr. President, these developments that present a new reality must be dealt with in a spirit of responsibility, must be dealt with decisively based on the principles and values that we are guided by. All these developments has brought to the fore the issue of Security Council reform. The international community must pay due attention to this issue. We are more and more convinced that the Council today needs an African voice, a voice of reason, a voice on commitment, a voice of responsibility. Against this background, the African position in the negotiations on Security Council reform is based on the principles of the Esselwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. This is the main and only frame of reference. This frame of reference has been strengthened also by the arguments contained in the outcome communique of the 15th summit of the C10 held in Oyala in Equatorial Guinea in November 2023, in addition to the outcome of the 11th meeting of the C10 foreign ministers hosted by Algeria last June. The arguments can be summarized as follows. We call, first of all, for redressing the historical injustice inflicted on the African continent. It is the only group that is not represented in the permanent membership category and is underrepresented in the non-permanent membership category. This is why Africa calls for its right to be allocated 2 permanent seats and additional 2 non-permanent seats, with all the privileges associated with these seats. Second, we call for the reform process to ensure the effectiveness of the Council and its ability to act in the face of increasing challenges to international peace and security. We need to develop a vision that allows the Security Council to dissociate itself from polarization and to focus more on its role and responsibilities according to the Charter of the UN. Third, we call for a resolution that is not only confined to ensuring more representation for developing countries, especially Africa. The reform must include issues related to the working methods of the Council, the use of the veto right, and the interaction between the Council and other UN entities. Expanding the membership alone does not ensure the necessary effectiveness if the working methods are not improved. Representation without effectiveness is insufficient, and effectiveness without representation does not achieve the required and desired goals. Fourth, permanent members in the Council must demonstrate explicit commitment and support to the reform process by responding to the aspirations of the African continent, the legitimate aspirations. Permanent members must participate in a constructive way in the IGN and work seriously to reach a consensus on Security Council reform. The General Assembly and the IGN must remain the only platform to discuss Security Council reform. Any attempts to change this and allow for parallel plans must be rejected. Mr. President, these are the ideas that I wanted to convey to you on behalf of my country. Algeria is firmly committed to the Common African Position under the leadership of the C10 coordinator, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, His Excellency Julius Maada Bio. Against this background, as a non-permanent member of the Council, Algeria is going to remain a faithful voice in the service of Africa and its aspirations. We are committed to pushing for redressing the historical injustice inflicted upon Africa when it comes to inequitable regional representation on the Security Council. In the same spirit and with the same commitment, we will do our utmost to maintain the credibility of the Security Council and ensure its ability to respond promptly to increasing challenges to international peace and security. I thank you for your attention, and may the peace, mercy, and blessings of God be upon you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. McGraman, for that statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Shinsuke Shimizu, Ambassador for Tokyo International Conference on African Development, Ambassador Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, Ambassador Special Envoy for UN Security Council Reform and UN Security Council Elections Affairs, and Ambassador for International Economic Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan.
I thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres, President of the General Assembly, Denis Francis, and Mrs. Mbete for their insightful briefings. I begin by commending the outstanding leadership of Your Excellency, President Bio, in holding this timely debate. Japan welcomes Africa's initiative in taking a driver's seat in our shared journey of Security Council reform. As Africa has suffered historical injustice, it carries a powerful voice which reverberates around the globe. Security Council reform is at a critical juncture. Current geopolitical developments have exposed the many challenges surrounding the body. If the Council continues to lack fair representation, its legitimacy, credibility, and effectiveness, and even that of the UN as a whole, will erode. That will serve none of us. As a Council member, Japan has worked together with the A3 to enable the Council to fulfill its expected functions. Japan recognizes Africa's growing contribution to the world peace and security, and welcomes Africa's efforts to shoulder more responsibility in the Chamber. The landmark resolutions 2719 on financing of AU-led peace support operations adopted last year is a case in point. Given Africa's essential role in the Council, redressing the historical injustice against Africa and other unrepresented and underrepresented regions is long overdue. To rectify the existing imbalances and the ineffectiveness, the Council has to be reformed with an expansion in both permanent and non-permanent membership. On reform and other issues alike, Japan is a long-standing partner for Africa. Our guiding principle is to support African ownership and co-create solutions through partnership. Since 1993, Japan and Africa have strode forward together under the TICAD, Tokyo International Conference on African Development Framework, guided by our shared goals. Later this month, ministers from African countries will meet in Tokyo again to discuss how Japan and the international community can contribute to Africa's endeavor to tackle their challenges and lay the groundwork for the upcoming TICAD 9 summit next year. Our approach of respecting the principle of African solutions to African problems is consistent with our wide-ranging cooperating initiatives, such as our contribution to the UN Triangular Partnership Programs, the AU Peace Fund, and the PKO training centers in Africa. For Security Council reform, Japan's approach does not vary. We support Africa's aspirations and work side by side, thereby enabling the Council to better address issues in Africa and beyond. Japan, in our national capacity and also as a G4 member, proudly supports the common African position, including no less than 2 permanent seats for Africa. Mr. President, pivotal opportunities await. The Summit of the Future will be a vital forum to set out the progress made so far concerning reform discussions and send a forward-looking message for future negotiations. Japan supports paragraph on Africa in the current draft text of the Pact for the Future, which rightly touches on the imperative to redress historical injustice. After the summit comes the next critical round of the intergovernmental negotiations. We very much look forward to Africa's reform model being submitted for discussion, as was announced by Sierra Leone on behalf of African Group in the recent IGN, and to further advancing efforts to develop a consolidated model as a concrete step forward. Mr. President, as you rightly stated during the general debate of the high-level week last year, the historical injustice endured by the African continent remain unsolved in the IGN. We have to remind ourselves that the only way to resolve this imbalance is to expand not only non-permanent seats, but also permanent seats with all existing rights and responsibilities. Throughout the history of IGN, the vast majority of member states and groups, including the African group, the G4, L69, CARICOM, the Nordic group, the Benelux group, and several permanent members have been calling for the expansion of both categories. This should be a guiding formula for our actions going forward. We must not lower our ambitions. Just as with other pressing issues facing the UN, we need to come together at a negotiation table in the quest for reaching tangible deliverables through negotiations on a single text. Let me reaffirm our commitment and readiness to do so. We count on Africa as an indispensable partner along the way. You can count on us as well. Finally, I would like to add Japan aligns itself with the G4 statement to be delivered by India later. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Shimizu, for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I wish to thank you for convening this thematic debate on the major issue that is Africa's representation on the Security Council. I welcome the presence of the UN Secretary-General and that of the President of the 78th session of the General Assembly, Mr. Denis Francis. That presence bears witness to the importance that we collectively attach to Security Council reform and to the legitimate aspirations of Africa. I also wish to thank Ms. Mbete for her briefing. Mr. President, this reform is awaited by the vast majority of UN member states. France firmly believes that an expansion of the Security Council across its two membership categories is vital to strengthen its legitimacy and its representativeness, whilst at the same time preserving its ability to make decisions. That is the bedrock of our collective architecture. We firmly believe that this reform is possible in accordance with the Charter, even in the absence of absolute consensus. That indeed was demonstrated by the previous reform of 1963. Mr. President, France's position is clear, long-held and unwavering. It is utterly illogical that Africa, that accounts for more than a quarter of the UN member states, is not represented among the permanent members of the Security Council. That must and can change now. It is in this vein that we organized, with the participation of the UN, the African Union, C10 and our partners from G4, a roundtable in Addis Ababa in last April on Security Council reform. A reform is possible and Africa can be the catalyst for it. To usher in that reform, we need to undertake without delay concrete negotiations on the basis of a draft resolution. We tirelessly defend this position within the IGN process. The Summit for the Future on the 22nd and 23rd of September will offer a unique opportunity to reaffirm that goal. France believes, as do the majority of states, that an expansion in the two categories of members and an increased presence of Africa, including among the permanent members, are both necessary to achieve that goal. The text of the Pact for the Future must do its duty and reflect this collective ambition. Mr. President, I wish to conclude my statement addressing the issue of the veto. Since 2015, France, with Mexico, has championed an initiative which is separate from Security Council reform in and of itself. It doesn't require an amendment to be made to the Charter. It aims to limit the use of the veto in cases of mass atrocities. The goal of this initiative is twofold. One, to consolidate the legitimacy of the Security Council, and two, to strengthen its ability to fully shoulder its responsibilities when it comes to the maintenance of international peace and security. The current crises on which the Security Council is gridlocked demonstrate the relevance of that initiative. It's already supported by 106 states throughout all regions of the world. We call upon those that have not yet done it to accede to this initiative to get things moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative of France, for that statement. And now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President of the Security Council, Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Council, Mozambique wishes to commend the Sierra Leone's presidency for convening this important high-level debate. We thank His Excellency Mr. Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his strong, principled, and long-standing advocacy and friendship with Africa in search for a just and fair global peace and security architecture. We are grateful to His Excellency Mr. Denis Francis, President of the General Assembly, for his emphatic support for the strengthening of Africa's role in global affairs. We thank Ms. Chitembile Mbet for our excellent presentation before the Council. Your Excellency, Mr. President of the Security Council and the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, I have been instructed by your brother, His Excellency Mr. Felipe Jacinto Nyusi, President of the Republic of Mozambique, to convey his warmest greetings and heartfelt congratulations to Your Excellency for brilliantly assuming the presidency of the Security Council. We, Mozambique, and the African continent at large highly value Sierra Leone's strong leadership of the African Union Committee of the 10 heads of state and government on the United Nations Security Council reforms, C10. Since 2005, Sierra Leone has been at the forefront in advocating the reform of the United Nations Security Council and ensure Africa's permanent representation as enshrined in the Isle-Win Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. Today's high-level debate is a clear testimony to Sierra Leone's continued commitment to this sacred mandate. Mr. President, the issue before us has been addressed in many different fora, notably in the context of the intergovernmental negotiations on the question of equitable representation on an increase in the membership of the Security Council and the related matters, as per General Assembly Resolution 62557. We note with regret that the Security Council's engagement in that process has been modest, to say the least. The Council's position has not changed much since the 1965 expansion that added 4 elected members to the organ. This historical paralysis has become untenable and problematic in recent years as crises proliferate and the institutional limitations of the Council, particularly the deficit in representation, become more apparent. The Secretary General has eloquently articulated today and during our signature event in May, dedicated to solidifying Africa's role in addressing global Africa's challenges. He said, and I quote, "We need to embed Africa participation and leadership across the global peace and security architecture. Today, African countries continue to be denied a seat at the negotiating table, including in the Security Council." End of quote. Mr. President, despite continued and unequivocal support for the common African position by the overwhelming majority of the United Nations member states, progress towards Africa's quest remains elusive.